When I was a little girl, I was always amazed at my grandma's ability to cook for what seemed like huge amounts of people. Whether it was a family get-together, I have a pretty large extended family, or she was helping with a church meal, if you went hungry, it was your own fault. But even on top of that, it was amazing to me that even though she had to feed all of those people, there were still leftovers after you had eaten so much that you could barely move. She had what seemed like this uncanny ability to provide. Through feeding people good food, she cared. Making sure your belly was satisfied was her way of showing her love for us and for those around us. So it's no wonder that she's at the forefront of my mind as I think about our gospel lesson for today, Jesus feeding the 5,000. Now, I've always liked this story, and not just because it reminds me of my grandma. This story holds so much more and goes so much deeper than just a bunch of people being fed. While yes, 5,000 hungry people being fed is impressive and amazing feat to think about, we can't get stuck right there in this story. Because in this story, Jesus shows us so much more than his ability to perform a wondrous sign. One thing to note in John's gospel, the signs that Jesus performs are pretty important and they deserve our attention. But in John's gospel, a sign is used to signify to us who Jesus is. The sign serves the purpose of drawing us to the character of who Jesus is and what Jesus means for us and for the world. The signs that John includes aren't there just to impress our minds that Jesus can do these things, but they're there to show us why Jesus does them. So what does Jesus feeding 5,000 hungry people tell us about Jesus? I think it reveals a lot of things about Jesus, but to begin with, it reveals to us God's desire to be near God's people. A little detail that we sometimes miss in this account of Jesus feeding is that Jesus himself is the one who feeds the people. Jesus is the one who takes the bread and the fish around to all of those people. He mingles with them and he makes sure that they're satisfied. Jesus shows here his character, that God is loving and desires to be accessible and available to all the people of God. God desires to be in touch with God's people. And the really good news, my friend, is that this promise still applies to us today. We are still promised that Jesus desires to be among us. We are still promised that we are loved and cared for. We are still promised that God is accessible to us in all of our need. And we're still promised that we will be fed. So in keeping with this theme, we expand on this idea in another way. We move from hearing a story of this feeding to hearing the story of the disciples' fear as they cross a dangerous sea one more time. We've heard already this summer a story similar to this one, the way that Mark interprets a sea journey. So we would think that the disciples should be used to crossing a stormy sea, or at least have some idea of what's coming up. But their reaction is understandable. They were crossing water that was treacherous and threatened to sink their ship with them in it. So I would be scared too. But this little story that detours us a bit points out the presence of God once more. In the midst of their fear, Jesus shows up. They're terrified, but Jesus shows up and he says to them, "Here I am. Stop being so afraid." Jesus is present with them in their fear. And again, we're reminded of this promise that it extends to us too. This isn't a story just for the people of John's community long ago, but it's a story for us today too. I've been reminded and shown so many times this past year that even in fear and trembling, God is present. Even when we're starting a new adventure and aren't really sure what to expect, God is there. When we're experiencing a loss and trying to navigate life without our loved one or life with a new diagnosis, God is present. Even when we're trying to figure out where our next meal is coming from or how we're going to pay rent this month, God is there in that fear and need too. These stories, my friends, remind us of that. Jesus meets the needs of all those that he encounters in this story. Whether it was hungry bellies that needed to be fed or frightened hearts that needed to be reassured, God was present, and God provided just the right things at just the right time. And God promises the same for us. We're promised that we'll too be fed, whether it's physically or in some other way. And we're reassured that God is present in all of life's circumstances. Even in the midst of fear, God is some way, somehow there. This story reminds us that God isn't only present in the miracles of life, but is also present with us in simple presence too. And this can be a hard thing for us to focus on. It's easy to spot God in the miracles of our lives. It's easy to point to something good and to say to ourselves, well, obviously God is there. But it's difficult to look at a tough situation and see how God is present. It's easy for us to get stuck in the muck of a situation and to feel totally abandoned and like God couldn't possibly be there, that there's no way that we're provided for. But what if we changed our thought process on this just a little and considered for a moment how God is present even in the chaos or the ordinary? What if we stopped in the midst of our thoughts of abandonment or loneliness and looked for how God was present? Maybe we'll surprise ourselves and see that God is present in multiple ways, maybe even more than we expected. Or maybe we'll realize that God shows up in ways that we wouldn't have thought of ourselves. God may not give us exactly what we're expecting, but God still gives, and God is still there. Or what about this idea? What if we were determined to be the presence of God in the midst of someone else's fear or loneliness? What if we were the presence of God in the ordinariness of life for someone else? What if we were more like Jesus in this story and were intentional about meeting people where they were on their walk through life? What if we really considered for just a minute what it was that someone else needed and tried to provide that for them? How can we embody God's essential desire to be with God's people? How can we reflect God's essential loving character? This week's story begins us on a 6-week-long journey through stories where Jesus proclaims himself as the bread of life. So, how do we consider how Jesus is the bread of life in this story? How exactly does the story illustrate that idea? Now, maybe the answer is obvious in that the story tells about a miracle where 5,000 people were fed, maybe with more than food. Or maybe our idea of the bread of life is stretched a little, and life means presence with others too. Either way, there are things for us to think about in this story, and we'll continue to have this story in the backs of our minds as we walk through John's 6th chapter together. So keep that question in your head. How is Jesus the bread of life, and what does that mean? So just like my grandma showed her love for us through feeding us, so does Jesus in our story for this week. Although I do have to admit, I think Jesus has a leg up on my grandma. But this story is so much more than just a story of people being given something to eat. They were fed in other ways too, and we are promised the presence of God and the reassurance that we won't be left behind. And even beyond that, it's a challenge to us to embody the same things. So, dear friends, consider this week how you'll be like Jesus and feed the people. Or maybe we too can join together with someone who needs a little reminder that God is present in all ways. Amen.